Bridgerton is filled with characters who have stories and backgrounds we don't fully understand until their season comes, many of whom have complex and interesting narratives, and Sir Phillip Crane is one such character. But who is this character? In the books, Philip is the husband of Eloise Bridgerton, the fifth sibling of the family. However, I believe we're getting ahead of ourselves, so let's go back a few years to tell you the story of Sir Phillip Crane's life. Phillip Crane was the second son of Sir Thomas Crane and Lady Crane, who died during childbirth. Philip and his brother, George Crane, were raised under the strict watch of their father, a harsh and demanding man who sought to make perfect men of his sons, especially Philip. George and Philip were very different. The former, 2 years older, was a charming and agile boy who seemed to do everything right, earning people's goodwill just by being himself. He was the perfect stereotype of the firstborn heir, well suited for the role of father and lord of the lands, which pleased Thomas. However, Thomas found the opposite in his younger son, Philip, who was clumsier, less refined in his tasks, and had an eccentric obsession with plants. Philip's childhood was filled with physical and psychological abuse from his father. Constantly, his father tested him by forcing him to perform tasks at which he wasn't as proficient as his older brother. He spent hours around his home, Romney Hall, with his arm outstretched until all his muscles ached, holding his breath while aiming at whatever target his father had decided on. Each time he pulled the trigger, he prayed the bullet would hit the center. If he hit the target, his father wouldn't beat him. It was that simple, and that desperate. Despite everything, living under the shadow of his older brother and suffering the consequences of not being at his level, they loved each other. George always tried, whenever he could, to shield Philip from their father's punishments. One day, when Philip was just 12 years old, his father forced him to accompany him hunting. Philip was a good rider, but not skilled enough for the jump his father had just made. Despite everything, he tried, knowing that if he didn't, he'd be branded a coward. Unsurprisingly, he fell from the horse. In fact, the horse threw him off. Miraculously, he wasn't hurt, but his father was furious. Thomas Crane's vision of British manhood was quite narrow and, of course, didn't include falling off a horse. His sons had to be perfect riders, shooters, fencing, and boxing champions, and always the best. And God have mercy on them if they weren't. George had made the jump, of course. George was always better than him. And he was also 2 years older, 2 years bigger, 2 years stronger. He tried to intervene to avoid the punishment, but then, Thomas also turned on him for meddling where he wasn't called. Philip had to learn to be a man, and Thomas wouldn't tolerate anyone interfering, not even George. Philip didn't know what was different about that day's punishment. Usually, his father used a belt that, over a shirt, didn't leave marks. But that day, they were near the stables, and the horsewhip was within reach, and his father beat him with even more rage than usual. When the whip broke Philip's shirt, Thomas didn't stop. It was the only time his father's beatings left a mark he would live with for the rest of his life. Years later, Philip went to Cambridge and studied botany, finishing top of his class, and he also practiced boxing, becoming one of the best. He truly loved botany, but his main motivation for studying was to become a scholar and live as far away from his father as possible, and as the younger brother, nothing stood in his way, at least until George's death. George died in the Battle of Waterloo at just 23 years old, while Philip was 21. With George's death, Philip became the heir, inheriting the lands, the title of baron, and all the responsibilities that came with it. Sir Thomas, to Philip's relief, died 2 weeks later, and in reference to his departure, Philip burned the stick Thomas used to beat him regularly. From that moment, Philip became Sir Phillip Crane. However, his brother's death left him not only with lands and commitments, but also a legacy to continue, including an engagement to Marina Thompson. George and Marina had been engaged for several years and were still engaged at the time of his death, so Philip, as the only living member of the Crane family, felt obligated to honor his brother's commitment by marrying her. Philip never wanted that life. In fact, he never even considered the idea of being a father. His brother was the charming one with the gift of people. He always knew what to say and do in every situation. Philip, on the other hand, was quieter, more reflective. George was supposed to marry Marina, and together they would have half a dozen perfect children. Philip would be the brusque and eccentric uncle living in Cambridge, spending his days in the greenhouse doing experiments no one else understood or cared about. That's how things were supposed to go, but everything changed on that Belgian battlefield. England won the war, but for Philip, it was little consolation when his father made him return to Gloucestershire to turn him into the perfect heir. To turn him into George, who had always been his favored son. And one day, his father died, right there in front of him, in the middle of a heated argument, likely exaggerated by the fact that his son was too big to kneel and be beaten with a stick. His heart gave out. And Philip became Sir Philip, with all the rights and obligations of a baron. Philip and Marina had twin children, Oliver and Amanda, but their birth was the only joyous event in their marriage. Marina was a depressive woman who constantly hid and cried, giving neither her children nor her husband a second of her attention. Philip didn't pay much attention to his children either. He loved them more than his own life, so he supposed he was happy with how things turned out, but he still felt like a failure. The family property and lands were thriving. He had introduced several new agricultural techniques he learned at university, and it was the first time the lands were profitable, so he managed the family estate well. While his father was alive, the lands had never yielded any income. However, dealing with his children was a challenge, especially since they behaved like little devils, and Philip, still traumatized by his difficult childhood, often felt angry and out of control. So fearing he might harm them and repeat his father's pattern, he stayed as far away from them as possible. Marina, for her part, struggled with depression. Philip tried to help her, but when she didn't improve, he gave up. One afternoon, Marina walked to a nearby lake and submerged herself in a vain attempt to end her life. She didn't succeed immediately, as Philip rushed to her aid, pulling her out of the water before she could drown, but she died days later from a fever caused by her suicide attempt. After this, Philip wrestled with both guilt and relief over her death, but finally he decided to focus on his work, building his greenhouse and helping the baronetcy prosper with his botanical studies. Sometime later, he received a condolence letter from Eloise Bridgerton, Marina's distant cousin, and the two became friends through correspondence. After a few months of exchanging letters, Philip invited Eloise to his home with the goal of finding a mother for his children, and the rest is history. Remember, if you enjoy this type of video, the best way to support me is by leaving a like, subscribing, and activating the notification bell. See you in the next video.